Go, Brody.
Welcome, everyone. Welcome to McKinsey Sustainability at Climate Week. And we're going to have a discussion today about how to make cities that are both resilient and sustainable. My name is Brody Boland. I'm a partner in our Washington, D.C. office. We're really excited to have such a kind of presence in a virtual discussion today. A couple of just quick logistical things. We are on Zoom. Please feel free to submit questions via the Q&A function. I know we would all much prefer to be together in New York, but absent that, we want to create as much of a conversation as we possibly can. I am very excited about our panelists today. We have four folks who bring both independently really interesting perspectives to this discussion, and then also very complementary perspectives. And I'll quickly introduce them, and then we'll jump into the discussion. We have Rachel Huxley, who is Director of Knowledge and Learning at C40. Bobby Tudor, who is Chairman of Tudor Pickering Holden Company and the Chairman of the Houston Energy Transition Initiative for the Greater Houston Partnership. Dan Zarilli is Special Advisor for Climate and Sustainability at Columbia University. And Catherine McCallum-Thompson is the Manager of Sustainability for the Infrastructure Business Line at Bechtel. So we have folks from, who work with cities around the world. We have folks who have deep experience in individual cities, and folks who spend their time in the infrastructure space, spend their time in civil society, et cetera. So really excited to dive into the discussion, and thank you all for joining us today. Just to quickly frame things up, I think everyone who's joined this discussion is probably very familiar with the importance of cities in the climate debate as a whole. Cities are 70% of global emissions, right? So if we're going to get to net zero, if we're going to address the sustainability challenge, we have to address the challenge in cities. They're also on the front line of climate risks. That has been painfully obvious over the past months and the past couple of years as cities have faced floods and fires, storms, and also just economic dislocations as industries shift through the climate transition. So if we're going to make cities, or if we're going to make the world sustainable, and if we're going to make the world resilient, we need to make cities sustainable and resilient. The challenge is significant. We have these legacy-built environment. We have the institutional landscape of cities, the economic composition of cities, all of which need to shift dramatically in order to make this transition. But I think the exciting thing about cities and the exciting thing about this discussion is that as we work towards a vision of sustainable and resilient cities, we're also able to envision a sustainable, resilient future that allows us to have increased prosperity, to live more kind of rich and meaningful lives in the places we call home. So welcome to the discussion about cities and resilience and sustainability. We want to make this conversational. I'm going to actually ask each of our panelists just to start off with a little bit of a rapid fire question to frame up the discussion around what is the biggest challenge cities will face through the climate transition. And maybe Rachel, I can go to you first.
Yeah, sure. So I think in terms of the biggest challenge, it's moving fast enough and bringing everyone with us. So in terms of speed, cities are leading and no one's doing more than cities, but we're still not doing enough. So we need to radically accelerate the speed and scale of change. And a particular challenge for cities, of course, is the wider system change that's outside of their direct control, but is still really critical and that we need from all levels of government and across all sectors. And in terms of the second part, bringing everyone with us, we need to ensure that the transition is equitable, and that's not going to be easy. But we do need to do it both pragmatically to gain that widespread support and participation that is needed, as well as from a principled standpoint to make sure that climate action leads to more equitable and just cities. So for me, it's moving fast enough and bringing everyone with us.
Thank you, Rachel. Dan, over to you.
Yeah, thank you. And I think it's a really important question on, the key challenges that we face as a city. We can start with knowing that it's going to get hotter, it's going to get wetter. Of course, we're seeing higher likelihood of the most intense coastal storms, sea level rise. Heat kills more New Yorkers than any other natural hazard. And we saw clearly with Hurricane Ida what rain can do in a dense urban environment with old infrastructure. with tragic results here in New York City. And there's both a technological as well as a justice angle to this that we need to consider. But I think that to really answer your question, I think the core of this is that we cannot adapt our way out of this. We will eventually reach the limits of what resilience can provide in our cities if we don't rapidly slash emissions. And I think, too often we think of these two ends of the climate conversation, resilience and sustainability, as maybe two sides of the same coin, but they're the same conversation. And it's really important that we know that we need to continue to act faster to slash emissions in order to manage the climate risks that we already have and to keep them from becoming totally unmanageable.
Thanks, Dan. Catherine.
So I think, when you look at cities, they're so different, around the world and in different climate contexts as well. So I think one of the challenges is for cities that don't have robust plans already is to determine what they should do, what's the next right thing to do. And that'll, of course, vary depending on their circumstances. And then putting that into the mix, as Rachel said, quickly, but in a way that, kind of accomplishes multiple goals. And I think that's one of the harder things to do, as well as integrating climate concerns, whether it's adaptation or mitigation, into the things that they're already doing so that they're making sure they're not going the wrong direction, for some of the things they're pursuing to achieve additional objectives.
Thanks, Catherine. Bobby.
In the case of Houston, Texas, we have two distinct but obviously related issues. One is just the issue of overall resilience. We are a coastal city. We sit just miles from the Gulf of Mexico. It's hot already. It's wet already. And thus the issues associated with changing climate are quite acute for us, just given our location. The related issue is that about 40% of our total jobs are related to the incumbent energy industry, 25% being direct and another 15% or so being what we call induced. So the overall economic health of our region is highly tied to our ability to transition our energy complex into the 21st century and into a more sustainable, cleaner, lower carbon world. And so we are focused on both of those issues in Houston, and they're highly related.
Great. So we heard issues of equity, of just the speed and pace of change that needs to happen around this trade-off between resilience, or maybe not trade-off, but the balance of resilience and adaptation on the one hand, and mitigation on the other, and the fact that we can't entirely do it in the former without doing the latter. Around how do we actually integrate it into our day-to-day business, the work we do, the projects we have, and finally, how do we think about the fact that where our starting point is and how we don't leave people behind in that transition. We are virtually in New York, right? This is New York Climate Week. And so wanted to start from New York, right? A city that has faced its fair share of climate-related challenges and will continue to do so. And then we'll kind of, expand across different city examples. Dan, you sit in New York. You spend a lot of time in the city, from various different perspectives. New York's obviously a prosperous city. It's a kind of center of finance. It also has a, large built stock. How do you think about the unique challenges in that kind of city, right? A kind of rich global city like New York?
Yeah, it's a great question, because I think we all know that the challenges that we face are very interrelated. And when I was with them in the mayor's office, we pulled together a strategic plan for the city on how to address our core challenges, now and out into the future. A plan called One NYC 2050. Where we looked at the core issues of our climate crisis, our aging infrastructure, the health and wealth inequities that we face in the city, and challenges of bringing more New Yorkers into our democracy, and laid out a comprehensive plan. It wasn't just a physical infrastructure plan for the city, but really a comprehensive look at how we can confront our climate crisis, address those health and wealth inequities, and strengthen our democracy. All of those, I think, feel very core to being able to solve the both local and global challenges that we're all facing. And for us on the climate side, it came down to a few key concepts and actions that we were taking to deliver on that. We need to decarbonize. We've set targets for being carbon neutral as a city. We passed world-leading legislation to retrofit existing buildings, which account for about 70% of the city's greenhouse gas emissions. That local law 97 is now in effect and being implemented and driving a lot of retrofits across the city and driving a lot of jobs as well in construction and related trades. And so we're doing a lot to make sure that we are ending our own contribution to the causes of climate change. But of course, we've locked in a lot of changes. And after Hurricane Sandy in 2012, we ended up unlocking about $20 billion of investment that we're making in coastal protections, in coastal communities, infrastructure all over the city, like our electric grid, our telecommunications sector, a range of infrastructure investments that we're making. But then there's a couple other angles to this too, and there's clearly the justice angle. And we have, as a city, have been pursuing a range of environmental justice actions to really make sure that we understand the history of things like redlining and segregation in the city and how that is driving unequal outcomes in poorer communities and communities of color across New York City, and taking action to make sure that we are overcoming those. And then we've also been looking at a range of what we were calling in the city accountability measures and working to divest our city's pension funds from fossil fuels. We've even taken some of the fossil fuel companies to court for consumer protection laws and other tort and damages. So we've really been thinking broadly about how to confront all the ranges of what we face in our climate crisis and making sure that we're investing to protect New Yorkers from what's already been locked in terms of risks, whether it's storms or heat or rain or sea level rise. And all of that's going to continue. And it's both projects as well as upgrading codes and standards, which I think is worth a longer conversation. And at the same time, doing everything we can to decarbonize and get fossil fuels and their impacts, burning coal, oil, and gas out of our energy system. And just yesterday, the governor here announced some major investments in new transmission to bring clean energy, hydropower, offshore wind, and solar into New York City, which is so vital to being able to get some of the most dirty fossil fuel generation plants that are in the city, and particularly in EJ neighborhoods, ultimately transitioned and shut down over time. So it's a range of things that we're doing to make sure that we're confronting this crisis head on and dealing with all the ramifications of what's already been locked in.
And mentioned some of the steps to kind of decarbonize the city of New York and the transition away from fossil fuels as part of that. Bobby, you're on the front lines of this. You have been leading an initiative in the city of Houston to shift from being an energy center that is based on some of those legacy energy sources to an energy center of the future and kind of transition Houston's economy accordingly. I'm curious to hear a bit of that story, right? How do you, in a city like Houston that's been centered around that industry for some time, rally folks around a pretty different vision of what the economic future looks like?
Well, there are a couple of different angles, if you would say that we have taken, but perhaps the most impactful just tends to be around overall economic prosperity for our region. And we have used job creation and/or job destruction as the best proxy for overall economic prosperity in our region. And our perspective here is that while oil and gas and fossil fuel production and consumption are not likely to go away anytime soon, they certainly will cease to be the growth industry that they have been for the last 20 years in our region. And while we certainly intend to support our incumbent oil and gas industries because what they are doing continues to be vital to the economy of the world, at the same time, we very much want to support and help create new companies and in some cases the pivot of extant companies to a fuel mix and energy mix that looks different than it does today. So people in Houston get that if we lose 600,000 jobs or so over the course of the next decade due to the improved efficiencies in the extant oil and gas business and the overall flattening and declining of demand for fossil fuels, then Houston will not be the same center for prosperity that it has been for the past 50 years or so. And so it is really, really critical that we continue to be a leader and really the world's leader in energy. And we think we can be. There are some very big, important kind of incumbent advantages that we have in that regard in Houston. But it's going to take a new approach and a rallying around the idea that we need a much lower carbon future to make that happen. And to give you a couple of examples, 60% of North America's hydrogen pipelines are in Greater Houston, Texas. So that's an example of a part of the new energy world where we have a fundamental kind of embedded infrastructure advantage. We have a lot of intellectual capital in this space, and my perspective is that these problems are highly unlikely to be solved without the participation and leadership of the incumbent industry. So it's really critical for the incumbent industry to be a partner in this and not a hurdle to it. We think we have crossed that line very effectively now in Houston, but obviously we still have a ways to go to get to the kind of technological and other progress that we will need to make.
So thanks, Bobby. So we've talked about New York, we've talked about Houston. Let's kind of widen the aperture a bit as we kind of zoom out on the world. And Rachel, you're in a unique position in the sense that you work with cities all over the world, from developed countries, developing countries, big cities, less big cities, cities that are facing a wide range of physical risks, that have a wide range of economic compositions. This is probably a hard question to answer for all of them. But, as you think about cities, they're in really different situations from, a New York or a Houston. What are some of the unique kind of challenges that they're grappling with? So maybe it's a mega city in a kind of developing economy. What's unique about the challenges that they're facing?
Yeah, good question. And I mean, I suppose one of the observations that we see working across, cities globally is that actually there are some unique challenges, but there's a lot of commonality across all cities. And so in terms of cities that have limited resources, all cities have got limited resources, but some that are struggling more than others, I think one of the key challenges I've raised is understanding the risks they're facing. So this is a little of what Catherine was already saying in her intro remarks. Just knowing the main hazards that they might be exposed to, who's most vulnerable, what communities and neighbourhoods are particularly at risk, what infrastructure is most at risk, are there power stations, key transport routes, food distribution networks, etc. So just understanding that to begin with is a real challenge. And that's a problem largely of data. So having good access to climate data to assess their hazard exposure and vulnerability and overall climate risk. We did some research into this a few years ago, and cities like Jakarta and Quezon City were reporting real challenges in terms of availability and accessibility, in terms of unsystematic collection and coordination. So as well as the challenges of data sitting in different places and different formats, some cities are trying to work across paper and electronic systems. So you can imagine the challenge that brings. So that I think would be the first challenge I'd sort of raise. The second one would be around capacity to take a coordinated, holistic approach. Now we know that's what's needed in terms of responding to climate change. It's a really widespread, cross-cutting issue, but coordination takes and taking a holistic approach takes a lot of time and energy. And that coordination has to happen across different levels of government, but also across different stakeholders. So, for example, with utilities and the private sector. And in terms of that holistic approach, it's really making sure resilience strategies are mainstreamed into wider city planning and policy, and vice versa. And that's no small task. And just to give, I suppose, a bit of an example of how cities are already making strides in that area is Dhaka City is, they were undertaking a master planning strategy for transport and mobility, and they wanted to understand, okay, how is transport being affected? How will it be affected by climate impact? And so they brought together various state-mandated and independently managed agencies to share information about, upcoming transport plans and infrastructure developments, so that they could identify those cross-cutting issues. So a really good example about how cities are kind of using low-cost measures to just bring people together to coordinate efforts. And also in Dhaka, they were really mainstreaming. Okay, it was a transportation exercise, but they were bringing in a resilience and an adaptation lens to that. And I think the last challenge I would kind of highlight is one of prioritization. So, of course, there's an awful lot that cities could do. There are many options and strategies for adaptation. So that can make it really difficult. And again, sort of echoing Catherine's point at the start, understanding where to start, what and how to prioritize. And of course, Brodie, that's the work that we've just had the pleasure of sort of doing together over the last 18 months. And the purpose of that report on focused adaptation was really to help cities understand where they could have most impact. Looking at 15 high potential actions that they can take around some of the low-hanging fruit that we identified in terms of systemic action that all cities can take, but also looking at hazard-specific actions. So I think probably those three would be the top challenges, I'd sort of say, understanding where they're at, and that's really about data, having capacity to kind of coordinate and think holistically, and being able to prioritize.
Mm-hmm. Catherine, Rachel had mentioned, and you had mentioned at the outset, how do we just make sure that all of the stuff that cities are already doing incorporates some of these considerations, the infrastructure they're planning and building, the way they're thinking about, how they operate that infrastructure. Curious, we've talked about a few independent cities and then, several types of cities. You're one of the folks that gets the call, right? When a city wants to plan a major project, whether it's a resilience project or a sustainability project. Curious both what kind of questions that call is asking when it comes to sustainability and resilience, but then also what are your observations on how cities can actually just make this part of the day-to-day thing that they do on an ongoing basis rather than something that's on the side?
That's for me, Brodie.
Yes, Catherine, sorry.
Just making sure you didn't use my name, so I wasn't sure. So I think I was relating so much to what Rachel was talking about, and it is a really good and helpful report that kind of breaks things down into common themes and then tailoring themes, which I think is very helpful. Because those are some of the questions we get. So sometimes if it's a question about master planning or helping, or a lot of times it's what priority, what phasing, how to choose which project to do and how does it fit into a wider program. Especially in developing country cities, many problems are very much interrelated. So you might have flooding as an issue, but it's secondary to poor waste management or lack of stormwater infrastructure, or and so things tend to be very tied together. So the most valuable activity is choosing the projects that do double duty or triple duty or even more than that, and trying to address things comprehensively. So there's sort of a physical piece, but then there's also often a governance piece and a management piece, the financing piece, and it all has to be looked at, holistically, as Rachel said. And so it's, are you doing the right project? How does that project fit into the overall context and the broader objectives? How many people are you affecting? How much risk are you reducing? How many, lives could be saved, in certain instances? Because that is often what we're talking about, actually, as was made evidence in, some of the recent disasters we've all been suffering all around the world. So, and then the other challenge is really then how do you tailor the right project so that you are fostering resilience, but doing it in an economical way? And in some cases, you have to leave space for later. So, if you're doing coastal protection, for example, you're trying to evaluate the projected rise, but then, if you do a 1.5 meter or 2 meter now, it would cost X. But if you did, 3/4 of a meter with provision for later adaptation or adding as it goes, then it would cost a fraction of X. And so really trying to think of, what's adaptable over time versus how much should you invest and be as resilient as you can early and upfront, and that will see you through. And it really, depends on the project. But those are the kind of analyses I think that are really useful to do, and that often, as Rachel said, depend on data, depend on your context-specific things, and then how do those proposed projects affect or are affected by all the other things that you're doing and all the other problems that you face.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Catherine. We're just starting to get some handful of questions from participants. So to everyone who's joined, please feel free to continue to send those in, and I'll try and get to as many of them as we possibly can. One of the themes that has come up across what all of you have said so far has been this collaboration, this theme of collaboration, and it's taken different forms, right? Collaboration across sectors, collaboration between the public and private sectors on a project, for example. Just kind of mobilization of a broader community towards a kind of transformative goal in a city. I wanted to explore that a little bit. Dan, you've been in a few different places on that spectrum in terms of in the public sector and in the private sector, in the civil society, now in academia. And curious, what are some of the things that you think we can do to leverage the strengths of all of those different actors to get this done, right? Each of them has their own things that they bring to the table. Are there collaborative approaches or creative examples you've seen that bring all those strengths together?
Yeah, definitely. And there's probably two different kinds of things that I'm thinking of in relation to that. One is very specifically about how universities and academic researchers can partner with the public sector. And we had a really great example of this in New York City, something called the New York City Panel on Climate Change, where the mayor for the last 10 years has appointed a body of academic researchers, climate scientists to help advise the city on adaptation measures and both the projections of what's coming, but also how to invest to manage those projections. And it was a really successful model because we were at the table together asking the questions so that the research needs were actually going to be policy actionable on the back end. I think too often in sort of university life, there's a paper and then it gets thrown over the transom or we hope someone reads it. When in reality, the questions that the policymakers and practitioners need answers to are slightly different to the ones that may have been asked. And so that deep partnership, I think, is a great model of it. The other version of this, I think, is more systemic, where bringing together multiple sectors, and this is, from the perspective of the mayor's office and the tools we have in order to embed resilience into our decision making and to move past the idea that we're building a resilience project, but instead we're going to change codes and standards. Whether it's zoning codes, building codes, design guidelines, so that every dollar we spend is helping us become more resilient and deal with the impacts of climate change. It's many cities would have a hard time funding a $1 billion project to provide coastal protection or upgrade infrastructure. But the city of New York, just as an example, has a almost $100 billion operating budget, has an almost $100 billion capital plan over 10 years. And so if you can actually leverage those dollars now and upgrade the standards by which you spend every one of your dollars against, whether it's energy transition and building retrofits and efficiency, or it's about flood protection and choosing where to build and how to build, you can have a much bigger impact. And that requires a much broader set of collaboration with the public and private sector and with the engineering and code societies and others to make sure that we're doing that in a smart way and bringing to bear all the tools so that every dollar we spend is helping us become more resilient, more sustainable, instead of waiting for the big slug of money to do the big project, which, generally that money runs out. And so And I think Catherine was making this point. We need to make sure that we are spending every dollar to make ourselves better protected. There's a lot of collaboration that's required to make that happen.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a theme that's come across in much of the research and conversations that I think we've seen lately. Rachel, you alluded to it as well. Just, how do we make sure that our day-to-day is investing, bringing us in the direction of sustainability and resilience rather than it being something on the side. Catherine, Dan mentioned the financial side of things, right? And just the scale of investment required to do this. Depending on what study you look at, the amount that's going to be required to invest in cities around the world to shift towards sustainability, to shift towards resilience, is some number of trillions of dollars, right? And so, curious, as we think about how do we actually unlock the financing necessary to make those investments, have you seen creative structures, collaborations that might make a project work when otherwise it may have sat on the shelf?
So this is an area that, everybody is thinking about. And of course, the whole emphasis on, ESG and metrics and financing and the financial community really thinking about, is their investment good? And not just because it's going to contribute to a decarbonized world, which we all understand that we need, but also because it's actually going to be a good investment. So, we talk about like the climate risks. And so there's physical risks and transition risks. And so the investment community is certainly thinking about all of these things. And so by doing that and by imposing, in effect, climate risk evaluations for things that they finance, then that's really helpful. I think that there's, certainly a play amongst the insurance companies who are thinking about, how do they play their part, because certainly they're getting hit very hard. I don't want to speak for them, but they're often interested in longer term investments, and because they're literally invested in the outcomes of resilience, then they have possibly more incentive. The challenge, especially on resilience projects, and I'm sure Dan and Bobby can talk about this too, is that unlike a service model where you're paying for, power, or you're paying for a transit system that's going to, have payback, resilience, who's paying for that? And so if you don't have an income stream of some sort, then it's hard to get private funding. But if you think of it from a, kind of an availability of service, availability of protection model, where a longer term investor is willing to do that and in effect, pay down that risk, then, we can start to unlock some things and get more partnerships together. But I think ultimately, there has to be value in the project. So is it the right project? Does the project do double duty or triple duty, as I said before? So can a parking garage, lower levels, also be designed such that it holds and retains water in some kind of storm surge event? So you would close it off, and allow it to be your repository, of excess water, and then design it so that it can exit that water, over time. But most of the year, it's a revenue generating parking garage. So there are things like that where you have to look more creatively at either projects that have multiple amenities and values for people, for the city, for urban life, or function in a couple of different ways depending on whether you're in a normal case or an extreme case. So we did some work with the Rockefeller Foundation a while back on refocus cities, and so we looked at those kinds of things, especially in sample cities, and the resiliency risks that they would face, and then how do you accomplish that with leveraging certain initiatives and projects to do more and to bring more benefits. And then when you can do that, then it's a lot of times easier to find more sources of funding.
Yeah,
Brody, if I could add to that. The challenges of the energy transition are inherently in challenges of scale. And with that comes massive capital requirements. So, the IEA estimates we need to be spending $3 to $4 trillion a year globally to be aligned with Paris. We're currently spending somewhere between $750 billion and $850 billion a year. So that is a very, very big hole. And I think too often the focus gets turned to the major integrated oil companies as if as if, look, if ExxonMobil and Chevron would just do the right thing, then we would have the money to solve the problem. And that's just not true. The total capital budgets of the major integrated oil companies total about $100 billion a year. And of course, the world will continue to need a lot of fossil fuels for a long time. So it's inconceivable that they could shift their entire capital budget away from fossil fuels to something new quickly. But my point is, even if they did, we're still $3 trillion short. And so what I think what we have to get our heads around as a society is where's the money going to come from? And until these projects are fundamentally economic to attract private capital based on return, the projects are going to have to be funded by sovereign governments and taxpayers. And that's, of course, where the politics get really, really difficult. And it's much, the politics of the supply side are a lot easier than the politics of the demand side. And I think that's what gets reflected generally in the broader debate about how to attack the problem. So I think a lot more work needs to be done by all of us, those of us who work in the financial sector, as well as those in the policy sphere and academia, around the money involved here and how to get this funded on a timeline that is really needed and critical.
Yeah. One of Bobby, you mentioned the scale of investment required in shifting to the IEA pathways, right? The Paris aligned pathways, and those are in addition to that, we need an additional bucket of change to become resilient, right, in our cities. And so we're almost talking about a scale of investment that's even greater than the trillions, Annalee, that you were referred to. Catherine, you mentioned the double duty thing. How can we make sure that every dollar we're spending tries to hit both of those buckets so we don't need double that amount? And Rachel, I know some of the research that you've done and that we've done together talks about the role of some of these solutions in doing that double duty, and the characteristic of things like, for example, nature-based solutions, right? And how they often have a bigger bang for buck, do both address both sustainability and resilience concerns, make our cities a little bit more enjoyable to be in, more livable, address equity issues. Can you just talk about what the kind of thinking is, or some of the lessons that we've had in recent years around how to think about projects that do double duty and can help close some of the capital gaps that Catherine and Bobby have just described?
The sort of one that springs to mind is something that Dan's probably better placed to talk about, but the New York sort of green infrastructure plan, and a lot of the arguments for that was that it was cost effective. So I think that sort of speaks to Bobby's points about the numbers kind of stack up. But in terms of, one of the joys of working at C40 is all of the great examples of cities that are getting on and doing. That's what the whole network was set up for, right? Let's learn. We've got to get on with this. Let's learn what we're doing. And that's one of the brilliant things about working with cities. And I think we've heard a lot of that today, from Houston and New York. But we see a lot more of it across the whole of our network. And I guess if you could just sort of give some examples, and then to your point about what are the lessons learned in terms of sort of addressing both resilience and decarbonisation. We see an awful lot of that going on across C40 network, and Melbourne's a really nice example, I suppose, to bring up. So they looked at a whole range of things that kind of started to all be integrated and work together. And so really doing that coordination, that holistic thinking. So they were looking at stormwater harvesting as a climate adaptation measure, but also recognising the synergies that has for mitigation, particularly from their perspective in terms of supporting parks, which provide a cooling effect and reduce energy consumption through less reliance on aircon. And that stormwater programme provides around 25% of irrigation from alternative non-potable water sources. So it's a considerable amount of support for the city. And then they've aligned that with other sort of city development in terms of the green space strategy that they have, and that built-in resilience. So they looked at particularly tree species and like mix of species and water-sensitive design and prioritizing temperature hotspots. And so these things are intertwined. You know, their stormwater plan supports their green space plan. Their green space plan in turn kind of thinks about water sensitivity and extreme heat. And then another example is that they're further kind of creative and innovative when they're building cycle lanes and using that as an opportunity to incorporate adaptation measures. So the cycle lanes are also have a lot of cooling green infrastructure and again have water sensitive design. So you're seeing this kind of holistic approach across all of the initiatives that the city's kind of developing. And we see that a lot in many other C40 cities. So Rotterdam combined adaptation with sustainable transport in their green tramways initiative. So having tramways in terms of sustainable transport, but with permeable green surface and cooling vegetation. So I think, again, it's that sort of how cities can think outside of silos, how they can think both short and long term and across sectors and holistically. And, you know, that isn't easy, and that does take a little bit of time and space, which often, you know, we're deprived of as we're trying to kind of get through the kind of immediate needs in front of us. I suppose a couple of other examples, one that Catherine made me think of when she was talking about the underground car park, but Kuala Lumpur had a really creative approach, and they had a mixed use tunnel, which is they used for stormwater management during heavy rainfall, and then they use it as a transport tunnel at other times. So it reduces flash flooding and it cuts traffic jams at rush hour. So again, you're seeing that kind of creative thinking about how much maximum impact we can get. And that sort of thing just reduces the need for, you know, you've got twice as much infrastructure in one, and there's huge embodied emissions in infrastructure, in grey infrastructure like that. So that's a huge carbon saving. And I think coming back to some of the things that we've talked around about policy and finance, you know, it's not always about kind of those sort of tangible, concrete actions on the ground. It might be smart initiatives, like, for example, in Rio, they launched a green building tax incentive, and that provides tax benefits to developers if a certain number of sustainability practices are implemented, and it brings resiliency considerations into that. So that comes back, I think, exactly to sort of what Dan was saying, how you build resilience into the kind of fabric of the institutions and the processes. And so you're not looking at kind of a huge outlay to do a big retrofit program. You're kind of building it into new developments across the board. So I think that would be some of the examples that spring to mind. And just, again, it is about that holistic cross-cutting thinking. But I suppose another thing I'd mention here is, and you know, maybe this is really obvious and a bit cliche, but I think commitment. And again, that's something we see in spades at C40, and it's really, you know, it's really fantastic. And I mean, you mentioned resource constraints already, and there's always a challenge for cities, but it's been an enormous challenge in the context of COVID-19, where cities were absolutely stretched to the limit. And yet what we saw from C40 is this, you know, the mayors at C40 was really just doubling down on their commitment to the climate agenda. And that was phenomenal, you know, that response. And you know, an example there is in Freetown, you know, really kind of facing all sorts of challenges. And they were still committed to a sort of climate agenda as well as a recovering from COVID. And so in the middle of the crisis, they did things like increasing water provision by 20% in informal settlements using rainwater harvesting system. And then as part of their recovery, you know, post-COVID, really continuing to invest in their forest program when that investment was under risk, by highlighting the dual benefits of supporting the adaptation that it was designed for, you know, planting trees in these upper catchment areas and high slopes to reduce like critical risks. But also focusing on the job creation that something like that brings and how needed that is in post-COVID recovery. So, yeah, I'm not sure there were sort of lots of examples, and I think a general theme of being resourceful, creative, and sort of holistic.
Yeah, it strikes me. I mean, there's a bunch to unpack there. I mean, you know, I think we've talked about this top level capital formation challenge where there's trillions of dollars that require reallocation or a little bit of a different color of money if as they are being deployed in our cities, as they're being invested in certain industries. And then there's the kind of bottom up issues on just how do you make a parking lot more sustainable? How do you make it more resilient? And then you also, Rachel, brought up some of the pandemic point. We're getting a bunch of questions in. I mean, I think one kind of package of questions is just around how do we get unstuck, right, from all of the momentum in our past, right? And I think that there's various versions of that, right? There's a simple physically getting unstuck, right? We have roads, we have transportation infrastructure built, we've got our sewage systems built, we've got our generation systems built. And now we have to think about that entirely differently. We have to retrofit our buildings. We have to, change our transportation networks. But then there's also the kind of getting socially or institutionally unstuck, right? We have the things that have made us successful in the past. Bobby, I think of Houston in this case, it's almost a kind of an innovator's dilemma of cities, where the things that made us successful in the past aren't going to be the things that make us successful in the future, but we tend to repeat the things that made us successful in the past. And so maybe just as a kind of full group, I would love to explore that, right? What are the things that we can do to really shift the story here and shift the momentum? Maybe Dan, going to you first, as you think about some of the work that you've done in New York and really changing the way folks think about how to plan a city, how to make a city resilient, have there been things that are unlocks that have helped unstick, whether it's the physical infrastructure or the social infrastructure? And you're on mute, Dan.
Thank you for that reminder. I think it's the great set of questions, and you it sort of triggered me thinking about your question of like, how do you make a parking garage more sustainable? And maybe part of the answer is don't build the parking garage. We need to build our cities differently so that we are like more dense. New York City has a third of the greenhouse gas emissions per capita than the rest of the country, and it's because we have mass transit and we have higher density. And there's a not every place in the country obviously is going to be New York City, but thinking about how we use public realm, not making ourselves so dependent on cars and urban sprawl and the kinds of things that drive higher emissions, that locks in the life scale of emissions, up front when you're building things. We need to build our cities differently. And I think, here in New York City, we're in the midst of a streets policy revolution with busways and bikeways expanding all across the city, open streets and open restaurants. Congestion pricing is, seems to be just around the corner, but then it keeps getting delayed. But there's a sense that, cities and livability and the amount of space we give over to cars is, wildly out of proportion to the benefit they provide in cities. And so, thinking differently about how we build them is a major start. And some of the work that we've done with C40, of course, and many cities have been going exactly this route and coming out of the pandemic with greater, bike lanes and bus lanes and safer pedestrian streets. And those are the kind of things that people in cities want. And that is also part of our answer to using, being part of the pathway away from fossil fuels because of the benefits, the sustainability benefits that higher density living can provide. And as the globe continues to get more urbanized, we need to make sure it does so in a way that is more sustainable and more resilient from the get-go, because it's so much harder to come back and retrofit things, as we all know, living with legacy infrastructure. It's so much harder to come back and retrofit than it is to make the right decisions up front and deal with these livability and sustainability and resilience questions right from the beginning.
Yeah. Bobby, any thoughts on, the innovator's dilemma in Houston?
No, there's two components of that for me, Brody. One would be just a collective consensus understanding of the depth of the problem. So that's a good first place to start. And I actually think we have made great progress in that, just kind of globally as a society. And we certainly have here in Houston. However, because of the scale of the problem and the amount of money required to address it, simply a collective understanding of the problem in and of itself will not result in solutions to the problem, because the scale of the problem is so enormous. And so, to my mind, ongoing progress around the commercialization of new technologies and the kind of fundamental economics associated with the change required, whether it's in infrastructure or any other kind of component of the transition, that's critical, right? And so, for example, here in Texas, where we're now the nation's leader in wind power, for example, which gives us a great edge in a transition to green hydrogen. That leadership in wind power would not have existed but for the production tax credits that were part of the policy to get critical mass around the wind business, and even more importantly, the ongoing decrease in the cost curve associated with the economics of wind power generation. And so, fundamental R&D and material science and batteries and all of that continues to be a place where we need to, in my view anyway, focus and pile in more money, whether it's via our national labs or via our academic institutions, because until the fundamental economics of these large scale changes that we need kind of cross that line to attract private capital, we are really going to struggle to fund this. As I said before, the politics of the demand side are terrible, right? And I would point recently to President Biden's jawboning of the Saudis to increase oil production. When people start paying $4 and $5 a gallon for gasoline, the politics around that get to be very, very bad. And so we just have to face up to that and realize that that we need to make our technologies fundamentally more economic to attract more private capital, so that we can get to these large scale solutions we need. That's not the only answer, obviously, and we in Houston are 100% on board that every incremental piece of this matters, and we have to be coming at it from a million different directions. But we, perhaps more than most places, are attuned to the scale challenges associated with energy, and it is an enormous challenge just staring us in our face. And until we make progress around the economics of that, I think our overall progress is likely to be quite limited.
There are a bunch of questions to kind of shift gears a little bit. The elephant in the room, the pandemic, right? 2 years ago, this event was in person in New York. Maybe one overall question and then a subset of that, and would open up to whoever's kind of keen to answer the questions. The overall point is just, how has the pandemic affected this? Have we seen an acceleration? Have we seen a window of opportunity opening? Have we seen some regression? And then maybe the more specific version of that, Dan, you had mentioned the benefit of having moderately dense, walkable cities in terms of the environmental footprint of those cities, and also in terms of the economics of making sure that those cities are resilient. There's some talk. I think it's still up for debate a little bit, but there's I think a little bit of a narrative that folks are moving to the suburbs now. The pandemic is, if there's an increase in remote work, you're going to have a greater suburbanization of places around the world. You might have more movement to secondary cities. What are the implications of that, and what do we have to do now to make sure that we're charting a course for our cities that leads to more sustainability over the long term? That's a bunch of questions. I'll open up to whoever wants to answer any part of that.
But let me I guess point out, I'm not sure that the conventional wisdom on where people are moving to is quite right, and we saw that with the census. New York City, from 2010 to 2020, grew by more than the size of Wyoming, I believe, like something like 600,000 or 700,000 new residents, and we're at a peak. And that count happened during the pandemic. And there was even a different analysis I saw in Bloomberg that showed that cell phone data was showing that more people moved into the metropolitan region than moved out of it. And so it is an interesting thing of trying to figure out exactly where people are going and why, and what that's going to mean for urbanization and future of work. I think that story is still being written at this point, but to get to the underlying piece of it, we need good policy that is both spurring the energy transition and making the kinds of denser, walkable urban environments as attractive as possible. And both of these, I think, are related questions, and it's spot on that it's policy that's going to drive this, to make sure that we're investing, in some cases, public money as well as private dollars, to get to these outcomes that we know we need. We're in a place right now with our climate crisis where what is possible and what is necessary are pulling further and further apart with every day. And so the actions we need to take are going to get more and more dramatic and radical if we don't take rapid action to transition now. And that means not just energy transition, but of course it means that, but it also means what's coming at us on the resilience end. It means how we live. It's all the choices we're making. The choices are getting harder and harder for every day that goes by.
Maybe Catherine, if you had any thoughts on that, and then I'm just with an eye on the clock. I think we may have to transition to our closing question. But Catherine, any reflections on the pandemic topic?
Yeah, I was just thinking that I think the shakeup of it all, led us all to realize the shakeup of climate change and climate impacts is going to hit us at least as hard and be at least as life-changing and disruptive. So I think it opened everybody up to thinking about, what are we going to do here? We've got to be more proactive on both sides, on the mitigation prevention side and then on the adaptation side. And then I think the interplay, as Dan said, is still being written, because people still have a need to be together. And without being able to be together, we've discovered how much we miss that and how important that is. And so the attraction of cities and having things that you're, close by and walkable and easy and pleasant and, that sort of livable cities, I think, is still very important. On the other hand, it, opened things up so people could feel a little bit more location flexible, which is good. But in the developing world, the attraction is the economic engines of the city still. And when people are struggling to make a living, and if the climate conditions in particular makes agriculture harder, in a lot of outlying areas, then people are going to still continue to flock to cities. And the big challenge there is that disorganized, chaotic, settlement that is done usually in a way without infrastructure, without provision, and then it makes the resilience and the risk, even harder in those places. And so that is all going to require a lot of our attention, I think, in the coming years.
And Brady, I know you're really conscious of the time, but I just wanted to sort of really quickly come in and if I may, just to echo some of the points that have been made. I mean, I think it's climate delay, not denial. That's our big issue now, and the speed at which we have to act. So totally supporting Dan's point. And I think at the moment, the stimulus is a missed opportunity. We're only seeing a fraction of the funds really being used to kind of address the twin crises of COVID and climate. And so at the moment, unfortunately, it's a missed opportunity. We need to really address that. And I think, that COVID has shown us how vulnerable we are. And it's also shown us that we can either choose to change by design, or we can wait till the crisis hits us. And so that's exactly the choice we have with climate. And as Dan says, every day that goes past, we lose time to make that decision, and the changes we make get larger. So I think it's a straight up kind of, how do we want this transition to be? How smooth do we want it to be? Or are we just going to wait until, the proverbial hits the fan, and then we've seen how devastating that is. But yeah, I'll let you move this on.
Yeah, no, I know that we only have a few seconds left. So maybe just a couple of words, literally, from each of you on your hope, right? So that we can end on a little bit more of an optimistic note. Next decade, cities, climate, what's your hope? And we'll do rapid fire. Bobby, over to you.
My hope would be that a collective understanding of the depth of the problem and the challenge will lead to massive investment in high-end R&D that moves the needle dramatically on large scale technologies that are necessary to help us solve the problem.
Catherine.
No more missteps. Make every step the right step forward.
Dan.
I'll go with the technology, heat pumps, and the kinds of things that allow us to electrify our cities with green energy. That's, I think, that's what I'm excited about.
Rachel.
I'll end on a resilience perspective. I think to see climate risk mainstreamed into city planning and action, as we've talked about, and if we can achieve that over the next decade, it would be so transformative for so many billions of people.
To each of our panelists, thank you for joining. Really appreciate you spending the time with us today. To everyone who joined the discussion in the audience, I wish we could see each other and have more of an interaction, but thank you for joining. Thank you for chatting and your questions, and I hope we can continue the discussion on this topic. I think a lot of really meaningful themes, rich questions, and exciting kind of challenges ahead of us. So thank you all. I think there will be a link at the end of this so that you can read some of the reports that are mentioned. There it is, that were mentioned throughout this discussion. But thank you all, and we'll see you next time. Cheers.